Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Scott. I'm one of the reference librarians here. And welcome to the Franklin Public Library and the Great Decisions discussion program tonight. Our program here tonight is brought to you by the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Holtz Family Foundation, and Carol and Tom Donovan. Just a programming note then too, we don't have Great Decisions next week. The final one will be April 8th, so 2 weeks from tonight, when they're going to be talking about multilateral institutions in a changing world order. So let me tell you about tonight's speaker. He is Dr. Mark Berlin, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University here in Milwaukee. He received his PhD and MA degrees from the University of California, Irvine. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on international law, international organizations, human rights, and the politics of torture. Professor Berlin also holds a Bachelor of Music degree from Berklee College of Music, and before pursuing his graduate studies, worked as a music producer and recording engineer in Chicago. He is the author of Criminalizing Atrocity, the Global Spread of Criminal Laws Against International Crimes, which was published by Oxford University Press, which examines how and why countries around the world have for over the past 70 years adopted national criminal laws against genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It received the 2022 Best Book Award from the Studies Association's Human Rights section. Tonight's topic is the future of human rights and international law. Professor Berlin will take questions at the end of the presentation, and the library asks that you keep questions and comments to the presenter and your fellow audience members respectful and curious. So please welcome Professor Mark Berlin.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Great. Thank you so much to the folks at Franklin Public Library for inviting me to speak tonight. And thanks to all of you for coming out and being willing to spend your time indoors on such a beautiful day to hear what I have to say. I'll say a few things at the outset here just so you know what to expect from this talk. I was asked to speak about the future of human rights and international law. But for the sake of keeping this talk manageable, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the human rights side of things than the international law side of things, though I'm happy to talk more about international law issues in the question and answer if you like. Also, to address this question of the future of human rights, I think it's helpful to first say some things about the past and the present of human rights. So my talk is going to be structured into 3 parts. I'm going to talk a bit about how we got to this moment with respect to the international human rights system. Then I'll say a few things about the current state of human rights and human rights ideas in the world, and then I'll sketch out what I think is necessary for maintaining and strengthening the power of human rights going forward. Finally, let me also say that I will talk about the United States specifically at points, so I'm going to, for the most part, remain at a kind of big picture global level as opposed to getting into kind of the nitty-gritty of the future of human rights in particular countries, because that's the focus of the Great Decisions kind of brief, and I think that approach makes sense for this topic. But okay, so now let me begin. Like I said, with a few words about how we got to this point. There's a certain irony about these things that we call international human rights law and the international human rights system, because they were not really meant to be in the first place. When the United Nations was created 81 years ago this year, human rights were kind of an afterthought. The UN was the brainchild of US President Franklin Roosevelt, and in the waning days of World War II, he persuaded his wartime allies, pictured here, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. He convinced them to help him construct a post-war international security organization whose mission it would be to prevent the outbreak of another world war. And so in FDR's vision, this new organization would delegate power, legal power and military power to the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, who would serve as the world's four policemen. And he actually used that phrase, FDR, the four policemen. And although this new organization would be dominated by the four policemen, later five, once they decided that France should also be part of this club, they would still try to get the rest of the world's countries to join this organization, and they would call it the United Nations, because that would help legitimate its mission by conveying a sense that it kind of represented the entire world. So when 50 countries arrived in San Francisco in April 1945 for the largest diplomatic conference in history to that point, to hash out the details of this charter, of this new organization, the United States, who was now led by President Harry Truman, because just 2 weeks earlier, FDR had died, the United States and its great power partners were hoping for a quick approval process for this charter that they had presented to the rest of the delegates. But those weaker countries, those kind of small and medium powers, they were dumb. They could see that this was an attempt not so much to bring them in as equals, as much as to kind of rule over them, to reference the title of David Bosco's excellent book on the history of the UN Security Council. It was an attempt to rule over them, albeit in exchange for those great powers agreeing to do the work of maintaining international peace and security. Also, those weaker countries knew that the great powers ultimately needed their buy-in to this organization if it was going to work and be legitimate. So the great powers eventually agreed to some minor concessions on the charter text, and among those were a few vague and unenforceable references to this idea called human rights. Nonetheless, over the next years and then decades, those small and seemingly inconsequential concessions about human rights in the UN Charter provided the toehold that human rights advocates needed to prod the UN into becoming a forum for codifying and promoting ideas about these new things called human rights. And these efforts first produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, which was the first international document to lay out a comprehensive vision of what human rights are and what they should include. Important to point out, though, the Universal Declaration is not a treaty. It's not legally binding. And the countries who drafted it deliberately did not include enforcement mechanisms in it because that was seen as too much of a challenge to their sovereignty, and frankly, they didn't want to be on the hook for complying with these prescriptions in the first place. So nonetheless, those small and medium powers kept pushing, and nearly 2 decades later, they got the UN to adopt the first in what would be a running list of legally binding human rights treaties. Treaties that established obligations for countries to protect human rights, most of which build on the blueprint of the Universal Declaration. So today, what we call international human rights law comes from a collection of treaties that impose legally binding standards on countries for how they must treat their own populations as well as other countries' populations. So these treaties cover a wide range of rights that we can classify into 3 categories. For one, they cover what we call physical integrity rights. These are the rights you have to not have physical violence done to your person. This includes things like the right to not be killed by your government or another government, but also the right to not be tortured, enslaved, disappeared, arbitrarily imprisoned, or to be deported to a place where you would face persecution or these kinds of violations. A second category of these treaties covers civil and political rights, like the right to a fair trial, due process, free speech, free expression, free exercise of religion, the right to seek asylum. There's a lot of overlap between these rights and the kinds of rights that are recognized in the US Bill of Rights. And finally, there's a third category called economic and social rights. And these are rights you have to a kind of minimum standard of living. These include things like the right to housing, the right to food, healthcare, education, Social Security and unemployment insurance, fair and safe working conditions, the right to join labor unions and go on strike, as well as the right to paid parental leave. So the way this works is that countries voluntarily join these treaties. You can't be forced to join a human rights treaty or any other kind of treaty under international law. And although there are some exceptions, generally countries are only required to comply with these obligations if they have voluntarily joined them, voluntarily ratified them. This map displays the rates of ratification for the 18 main international human rights treaties in the world. As you can see, interestingly, most countries in the world have ratified most human rights treaties. And so they are obligated to follow them. It's worth noting, though, that the United States, is a significant outlier in this regard, in ratifying relatively few of them. We can talk about that more in the question and answer if you're interested. But the first question people often ask about international human rights law is, well, how is it enforced? It's nice that countries are obligated to comply with these prescriptions, obligated to comply with the treaties that they ratify, but what if they don't? That's an important question, and it's a multifaceted one that we don't have time to delve deeply into here. But for now, what's important to understand is that international human rights law, like U.S. federal law, like Wisconsin state law, contains a range of formal enforcement mechanisms. But compared to those forms of domestic law, the enforcement mechanisms in international human rights law, just like in other areas of international law, the enforcement mechanisms are fundamentally weak. There are no international police. There's no international military, with the coercive power to enforce these obligations. Most enforcement of international human rights law is meant to take place in countries' domestic courts and domestic legal systems, such as, for example, when U.S. immigration courts rule that someone can't be deported because they would face persecution back in their home country. That's an example of U.S. courts, in essence, enforcing international human rights law. So to be clear, though, weak is not the same thing as powerless. David was weak, compared to Goliath, but he was still able to leverage the limited power he did have to defeat the giant. And there are many examples of advocates using these weak enforcement mechanisms of international human rights law to effect positive change. Nonetheless, it's indisputable that they are fundamentally weak. So, in my opinion, those forms of formal legal enforcement through international courts, through domestic courts, and UN oversight mechanisms, while they are important and they do have consequences, are, in my opinion, less important for the practical impact of international human rights law than the political resonance of the idea of human rights. In other words, what matters most is whether the idea of human rights animates people. in ways that causes government leaders to believe that violating rights would be costly, politically costly, economically costly, legally costly. In other words, because all the legal obligations in the world don't matter if people don't believe those obligations should matter, and thus are willing to act, whether that's vote, protest, or even revolt, in response to human rights violations. And for a good chunk of the second half of the 20th century, these ideas did animate people. Beginning in the 1960s and escalating in the 1970s and 80s, ideas about human rights were central to major social movements for freedom and justice in the late 20th century. That includes movements for decolonization in Africa and East Asia, for the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, for the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, for the pursuit of justice for atrocities in the wake of military dictatorships in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, and for the creation of international criminal tribunals in the 1990s, such as for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and eventually the creation of the International Criminal Court. In short, ideas and rhetoric about human rights were both an inspiration and an instrument for the greatest struggles for freedom and justice in the second part of the 20th century. Given that, it's worth taking a moment to address why, for decades, human rights ideas have been such powerful political motivators. At their very essence, human rights are prescriptions about the relationship between people and governments. They are about the ways that government power should be limited and the ways that government power should be used. But they're not just that. They also contain powerful notions about universality. That is, the presumption underlying human rights is that these principles are so fundamental to what it means to respect the inherent dignity and worth of every human being that they apply to all people in all places at all times. And you can see this reflected in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration that says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That sounds like a really simple idea, but it's actually very politically powerful with radical implications. So from the perspective of international human rights law, even if your country has not ratified the relevant treaties and thus is not technically legally obligated to follow them, it doesn't mean those rights don't exist for you. You are still entitled to those rights. It just means that the formal legal obligation for your country has not been activated from a kind of legal perspective. But so is that universal character, that presumption of universality that makes human rights so rhetorically and politically potent. When you criticize your government for violating your human rights, you're not just saying that the government is doing something you don't like or something unethical or something unwise. You're saying that the government is violating universal standards that are recognized as such by the entire world. That presumption takes these prescriptions out of the normal realm of kind of everyday politics and political disagreement and elevates them to some higher moral imperative. In essence, saying that these are ideas that, no pun intended, trump normal politics, that kind of override normal political conflict. And that's what makes them so powerful and effective as a political rallying cry. A lot of research on what social scientists call rights consciousness has shown that when people learn to see the harms done to them or the deprivation that they experience as not merely bad things, but violations of universal standards, universal human rights, they're more likely to take action to demand justice and to demand change. That's what makes human rights so powerful. and why so many different movements have seized on the banner of human rights over the past 80 years. And that's what makes human rights, the idea of human rights, so threatening to governments in the first place. And why those countries who negotiated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't want to include enforcement mechanisms. And that's why also the Trump administration has been trying since its first term to redefine human rights and what they are thought to include, since they understand correctly that notions about rights are uniquely politically potent and can inspire action. So, human rights are universal principles that limit governments' powers to use violence and to restrict freedoms while also obligating them to ensure minimal standards of living for their population. These ideas have been inspirations and instruments for the most important movements for freedom and justice over the second half of the 20th century. But how are they doing now? Let's take a moment to look at the current state of human rights in the world. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone in this room when I say that the current state of human rights in the world is not great. But before we get to that, I think it's important to acknowledge some good news. Given all the bad stuff going on in the world, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that today, the average person in the world lives a longer, healthier, and more abundant life than at any other time in human history. If we think of human rights as a tool, as a means to ensure that people and communities can live lives of their own choosing, to give them agency over their existence, then in a lot of ways we've made extraordinary progress as a civilization. For example, the average person in the world now lives twice as long as they did just 100 years ago. In the course of what amounts to a tiny blip in the 10,000-year span of human civilization, we have doubled life expectancy. Likewise, when I was born in the early 1980s, roughly 4 out of 10 people in the world met the international definition for living in extreme poverty, even when adjusting for inflation. Today, that number is below 10%. We can turn to education, a core mechanism for individual empowerment and social mobility. Again, when I was born in the early 80s, boys were more well represented at all levels of education around the world, but today those numbers are largely equal globally, with girls even surpassing boys in tertiary education. So these are all important outcomes, but we can also look at countries' laws around the world to see the extent to which they are recognizing new types or new categories of human rights. While the overall numbers are still small and geographically concentrated in Europe and the Americas, the numbers of countries around the world who now allow for same-sex marriage has been steadily increasing over the past decades. We can also see that now more than half the world's countries have abolished capital punishment. There are also dozens of countries who retain it on the books but effectively don't use it anymore. I could go on and show you many more graphs with similar trajectories about access to clean water, or rates of new malaria infections, or rates of women-owned businesses. And so on and so on. But in a lot of ways, from the perspective of human empowerment and self-determination, there's been no better time in history to be alive. Yet, unfortunately, those numbers only tell part of the story, and now we're going to look at some less hopeful data. Despite the average person living longer, being less impoverished, and living more empowered lives, recent years have seen many of the rights that have enabled this progress rolled back or under threat. Freedom House is a well-known and well-respected US-based non-governmental organization that tracks the protection of civil and political rights in every country around the world. Every year they issue a kind of report card that kind of gives countries a numeric score based on kind of a detailed rubric that, if you're interested, you can kind of look at their website and kind of see all their work and kind of how they explain everything. And they use these scores to classify countries into 3 categories, what they call free, partly free, and not free. And so this is a color-coded map from their most recent report covering the year 2025, which can give you a snapshot of the current state of civil and political rights in the world. For example, you can see that for the year 2025, the United States received a score of 81 out of 100, which I guess as a professor would be a B minus, I would say. So not great. And that score has actually decreased 12 points over the last 20 years. But what's more revealing than these scores from one country are the global patterns over time. So that same report includes this chart, which shows that for every year over the past 20 years, the number of countries that have decreased in their freedom scores, that is worsened in their protection of civil and political rights, has exceeded the numbers of countries that have increased in their scores. Likewise, over the past 10 years, nearly 2/3 of countries have become less free based on Freedom House's measures. In other words, the world has steadily been becoming less free over the past 2 decades. That's a remarkable contrast to the prior period, from the late 1980s through the 90s when I was growing up, when the world witnessed a steady kind of expansion of rights and freedom and democracy around the world. So I think that's likely not surprising to many of you. Even if you aren't aware of these data specifically, I think many people sense that the world is moving backwards in terms of state protection of human rights. And I think the instances that people have heard most about are the so-called backsliding democracies. These are countries that were thought to have achieved either kind of like the standards of liberal democracy or something kind of close to them, but which in recent years have been kind of going backwards in that regard. So these are countries like Hungary, Turkey, India, Israel, Argentina, Poland, and yes, the United States. In many cases, these declines have been driven by populist political movements in these countries that have taken a kind of a skeptical or even kind of outright hostile view to human rights standards. But as these data show, it's not just the backsliding democracies where rights have eroded in recent years, but many states that were already, I guess what we might call rights challenged, have gotten worse over the last couple decades. So the world has been growing less free over recent years. At the same time, more people are finding themselves in dire conditions. This graph shows the numbers of people in the world who have been forcibly displaced from their homes and living as refugees. Today, we are at record numbers not seen since the Second World War, driven in part by the explosion of internally displaced persons around the world. That is, people who have been forced from their homes for one reason or another, whether that's war, political repression, famine, but who nonetheless still remain within the borders of their own country. And as the impacts of climate change on people's livelihoods continue to accelerate, we're likely to see huge increases in this already record number as more and more people flee areas that are no longer hospitable. According to a report by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, 250 million people over the past decade were forced to flee their homes due to weather-related disasters that are only continuing to be made worse by human-caused climate change. And as the effects of climate change continue to get worse, these numbers will likely grow. Beyond these statistical trends, there's a number of qualitative trends that are harder to quantify, but are nonetheless observable. For one, we face new types of threats to human rights, in addition to all the old bad ones. The growing power and ubiquity of surveillance technology deployed by governmental and private actors not only threatens our rights to privacy, but can make it easier for governments and other actors to curtail our civil and political rights, or other types of civil and political rights. The sudden rise of artificial intelligence has introduced all types of pernicious new ways to violate human rights, whether that's through discriminatory algorithms that perpetuate human biases, or the ability to conduct large-scale misinformation campaigns of mass destruction, or the use of autonomous military systems to identify and even fire on combat targets. At the same time, human rights defenders, the people who put themselves at risk to advocate and struggle for human rights around the world, have faced tightening restrictions on their work and increasing threats to their safety. More and more countries, from India to Israel to Slovakia to Nicaragua, have been passing laws aimed at suppressing the activities of non-governmental organizations like those that promote human rights and democracy. In other cases, governments are using digital technology to harass and threaten human rights activists in new ways, such as by doxing them, spreading disinformation about them, or outright censoring them. This increase in assaults on human rights activism has been coupled with large-scale defunding of human rights work around the world. Traditionally, USAID, the kind of foreign aid arm of the US State Department, funds a lot of work around the world to support human rights and democracy NGOs by helping them build capacity, pursue litigation, and provide kind of direct services to communities. But as you know, over the last year, the Trump administration has totally decimated USAID, cutting over 85% of its programs, which has no doubt delighted dictators and human rights violators around the world. This is despite the fact that even prior to these cuts, foreign aid accounted, like the work of USAID, accounted for less than 1% of the US federal budget. So these cuts have set back progress on many fronts, including the right to health for many around the world. Unfortunately, these cuts have also licensed other major international donors like Canada, France, Germany, and the UK to make significant, albeit less dramatic, cuts to their own foreign aid budgets. So this is probably a good time to acknowledge that, to kind of borrow a horror movie cliche, in a lot of ways the call is coming from inside our own house. Beyond the cuts to USAID, there are myriad ways that the United States under the Trump administration is leading a full frontal assault on international law and norms related to human rights. The United States has not just been withdrawing support for UN human rights institutions like the Human Rights Council, which is pretty standard for a Republican presidential administration, but it's also going on the offensive to actively destroy international norms and institutions. For example, the Trump administration has imposed economic and other kinds of sanctions on personnel who work for the International Criminal Court. Sanctions are usually a tool to target rogue states or supporters of terrorism or human rights violators, but in this case, the Trump administration is now using them to punish an international institution whose job it is to uphold human rights and international law. The US has also been on a campaign to censor even non-binding language from UN documents that mention fundamental values like gender equality. Meanwhile, it's used human rights rhetoric as, I would say, a kind of a cynical instrument to advance a kind of ethno-nationalist political agenda. For example, under US policy, the United Kingdom is now one of the world's worst human rights violators, simply because it has DEI policies and seeks to regulate hate speech. Meanwhile, US ally El Salvador, where the government is engaged in a widespread campaign of torture and arbitrary imprisonment, mostly does nothing wrong from the perspective of US policy at the moment. But as you know, it's not just in the realms of rhetoric and finance that the Trump administration has been waging an assault on human rights. In practice, the Trump administration has curtailed rights or sought to curtail rights and violated fundamental protections in so many ways that I can only touch on some of the most egregious examples here. For one, there are the extrajudicial executions of suspected drug traffickers in international waters. I won't get into the legal arguments at the moment. I'm happy to talk about that more in the question and answers if you're interested, but suffice to say, there's near universal consensus among international lawyers that these killings, well over 150 people now, are straightforward murders from the perspective of the law. But also clearly in violation of the human right to life and human rights to due process. Then there is the torture and inhumane treatment the administration is aiding and abetting when it deports individuals from the United States to be imprisoned in repressive third-party countries like El Salvador or Eswatini. Oftentimes, I'll add, in violation of court orders. Turning to what's going on within our own borders, in lieu of cataloging all the ways the administration is violating human rights, I've included this graphic from a recent Amnesty International report, which details what it says are 12 ways the United States is rolling back democracy and human rights. For one, the Trump administration's aggressive and inhumane deportation initiative has ripped apart families and communities, traumatized children, and led to dozens of people losing their lives and scores of Americans and legal residents being illegally detained. I could go on and on. I don't have the time, but nonetheless, it's worth noting that Trump administration has curtailed or sought to curtail the civil and political rights of journalists, lawyers, political activists, students, LGBTQ+ folks, and refugees and asylum seekers. All the while, it has sought to dismantle the internal mechanisms for oversight and accountability that traditionally serve as checks on the government's ability to bulldoze over these rights. Turning away from the US and back to the bigger global picture for a moment, human rights face additional further political threats. On the one hand, we can see this in the rise of populist political movements that I referred to earlier, which is not a new threat historically per se, but one that is particularly ascendant at this moment. So by definition, populism is an ideology or kind of vague ideology that generally is grounded in claims about the will of the majority. Whether that will is a real will or an imagined will, it's based on a belief about kind of what the majority wants and asserts that that majority will should take precedence over all else. It's thus what we would call a majoritarian ideology. That ideology is directly in tension with the notion of human rights. Human rights are by definition a counter-majoritarian device. They are meant to secure particular protections regardless of whether the majority of the population thinks they should be disregarded. The whole point of rights is that there are certain minimal standards of protection and treatment that should be impervious to majoritarian whims. That's why the framers of the US Constitution put rights in the Constitution as opposed to just legislating them into normal law, because the Constitution is hard to change. So it's not surprising then that many of the countries we've seen backsliding, Hungary, Philippines, Turkey, El Salvador, Argentina, United States, have done so under the leadership of populist movements that usually invoke some what I would say artificial notion of the popular will. At the same time, on the political left, where human rights ideas traditionally have their strongest constituencies, human rights ideas are also under fire, as there's been a kind of growing disillusionment with their limits. This is a sentiment encapsulated by the title of the book by historian Samuel Moyn, Not Enough. So Moyn and others like him argue that international human rights law and institutions are no longer up to the job of addressing the most pressing challenges that we face today. They say that human rights ideas and the way that the international human rights system has traditionally operated have been too narrowly focused on civil and political rights that are meant to kind of secure the autonomy of individuals, and don't have enough to say about inequality within societies. Human rights, in essence, provide a kind of minimum floor that no one's supposed to kind of fall below, but they don't say anything about the relative distribution of wealth or relative distribution about political power in society. So as recent decades have seen growing economic inequality and increasing shares of economic prosperity and political power being captured by a narrow, wealthy elite, trends, by the way, that AI is only likely to exacerbate, there's an argument that human rights ideas, with their emphasis on individual freedoms, are not equipped to help us with these challenges and that we need something else. Okay, so that's a very broad stroke summary of kind of the state of human rights and human rights ideas in the world today. In the big picture, there's a lot of progress to celebrate, but that progress is threatened by the trends that I outlined regarding the dismissal and dismantling of international human rights laws and institutions, the political disillusionment with human rights, and new threats to human rights that we increasingly face in the 21st century. So where do we go from here? First, I just want to say that I approach this question with modesty. You know, I don't have all the answers, and if I did, we wouldn't be here in the first place. Nonetheless, to address the future of human rights, I think there are three things that human rights advocates, whether those are activists or community leaders or teachers or politicians or librarians or religious leaders or business leaders, need to do and to push for in order to ensure that human rights obligations and human rights ideas remain relevant and politically impactful going forward. So I refer to these as the three R's. The first R is to reinforce. That is, reinforce the moral imperative of human rights, reinforce the social and political power of human rights ideas. So what I mean is the need to vigorously defend human rights principles when they are violated or ignored or dismissed. The measure of strength of social norms, like human rights principles, is not whether or how frequently they are violated. It's how others respond when they're violated. You know, we have laws against murder in this country, obviously, but that just because thousands of people were murdered in the United States last year doesn't mean that the social norm against murder doesn't matter. We can tell it matters because of the response, because each one triggers condemnation, criminal investigation, and in many cases prosecution. And we can debate whether the criminal justice response to murder is effective or ethical, but the point is there is a robust social and legal response, which reinforces the social command that murder is wrong. Thus, the response to human rights violations is more important for reinforcing the strength and legitimacy of human rights principles than the actual violations themselves. So reinforcing human rights means aggressively calling out violations, not just as bad things, but as violations as such. For example, the extrajudicial executions of suspected drug traffickers in international waters is not just wrong because it violates US and international law. It's wrong because it violates the universal human right to life and the human right to due process of law, rights that are owed to all people regardless of who they are. The detention and deportation of preschool-age children is not just cruel and monstrous, it's wrong because it violates our fundamental human rights obligations to protect children from harm and their universal human rights to not be arbitrarily separated from their parents or punished for the actions of their parents. But if human rights are not part of the rhetoric, not part of the vocabulary of opposition and resistance, then the idea of human rights loses its political power, its political potency. So reinforcing human rights ideas does not just mean responding to violations, but also taking positive action to further legitimize and institutionalize human rights ideas. So though it might not be politically feasible under current conditions, advocates should work to get the US to join several core international human rights treaties that it has not joined, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. By the way, when it comes to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the United States is one of only 7 countries in the world that has not joined it, has not ratified it. And when it comes to the Convention on the Rights of Children, the United States is actually the only country in the world that has not joined it. So the United States should also incorporate these and other legal norms directly into its domestic laws, including filling current gaps in US criminal law, such as the absence of laws in the United States that criminalize torture, and the absence of laws in the United States that criminalize crimes against humanity. Finally, the United States should also incorporate human rights principles and other official procedures and policies, such as by doing what many European countries do, but which we don't currently do, which is mandating the inclusion of human rights principles and guidelines into the training protocols of law enforcement agents. Okay, so that's reinforce. The second R is for reframe. Critics on the left, like Samuel Moyn, who I mentioned, make a good point that international human rights law, as it was codified in the mid-20th century, has not kept up with the most pressing needs today, pressing issues today. When international human rights law was coming into being in the 1960s and 70s, many industrial democracies had robust welfare states, strong labor unions, and few billionaires. And we were also largely unaware of human-caused climate change, and the main threats to our privacy were, say, potential wiretaps of landlines or the FBI reading your mail. We live in a very different world today. So understandably, the main grievances motivating political discontent around the world have shifted. So today, in addition to the traditional threats to our freedom and security, we also face growing threats from economic inequality, basic affordability, corruption, ecological catastrophe, and AI and surveillance technology run amok. Yet, though human rights ideas weren't developed with these threats in mind, that doesn't mean they're not relevant anymore. The traditional human rights principles, like the inherent dignity and equality of all people, are as relevant as ever. So instead of casting about for a new paradigm to replace human rights, I think it's more useful to adapt human rights principles to these new threats and graft them on to new demands. With its emphasis on universality and inviolable protections, human rights offers the most politically potent and broadly appealing vocabulary for criticizing political power and the shortcomings of government. For example, in the 1970s and 80s, feminists seized on the vocabulary of human rights to assert the fundamental character of women's rights. And that vocabulary allowed them to make the case that the rights of women to be treated equally under the law should not be up for debate or something to be negotiated over, but are required by any worldview that claims to recognize the inherent and equal dignity of all human beings. Likewise, today's advocates for affordability or for universal health care or for AI regulation or for queer rights or for the rights of migrants and refugees would be well served by enlisting human rights principles and rhetoric for their causes and to frame their causes as not just politically or ethically desirable, but inseparable from the universal obligation that we respect the inherent value of all human beings. Okay, so that's reframe. Finally, the third R is for redress. We need to affirm the legitimacy and supremacy of human rights ideas by holding accountable those in power who have brazenly violated them. Once lawless extremists are no longer in power in the US, and I can't tell you when that's going to be, we're going to need a new kind of Nuremberg moment, a kind of transitional justice process or processes around the world akin to the one that the Allies pursued in the wake of World War II to prosecute the surviving Nazi leadership and produce an official accounting of the harms done. A process that reckons with the record of abuses and sets a new standard of accountability in conduct going forward. For one, if we want to make sure that human rights play a role in our government and politics going forward, then we need an accounting of the full breadth and scope of human rights violations committed by the current administration. We know a lot about the ways that this regime has systematically violated fundamental human rights, but there's still so much we don't know. We don't know the actual number of people that, how many people ICE has shot or how many people have died in ICE custody. We don't know the identities of people executed in international waters on suspected drug boats, and frankly, we don't even know if the government knows who they are. We don't know how many law-abiding and tax-paying immigrant families have been ripped apart by ICE's arbitrary deportation quotas and warrantless arrests. We don't know how many American citizens have been illegally detained by ICE. We don't know how people deported from the US are being treated while imprisoned in repressive and third-party countries. We don't know how many trans teenagers have suffered severe mental health crises or even taken their own lives as a result of the government's concerted campaign to tell them and their families that they shouldn't exist in the first place. And we don't know the full extent of how much the president and his allies have profited from the dismantling of government oversight over corruption. A justice process can help establish an authoritative record of truth, an authoritative accounting of illegal conduct and harm done. And it can help us break with the past and chart a new ethical and legal path going forward. A useful precedent from American politics is the way that the Senate's Church Committee that was established in the wake of the Watergate scandal cataloged so many previously unknown ways that the government had been acting illegally and violating the rights of its citizens. That work led directly to new, albeit imperfect, laws and regulations limiting the government's power to violate Americans' human rights and paved the way for a new paradigm of executive power that recognized important principles like the independence of the Department of Justice from the president. It's worth noting that some of those principles adopted in the wake of the Church Committee, like the independence of the DOJ, like the ban on political assassinations, are among the ones that the current administration has obliterated and has done so without any resistance from the Republican-controlled Congress. But redress is not just about truth. It's also about reforms to make sure that these kinds of abuses can't happen again. An official accounting of truth can help build the political will necessary to pass new legislation to codify human rights protections and fill other important gaps in our laws. It should also be the prerequisite for a constitutional amendment that overturns the US Supreme Court's ruling, giving broad criminal immunity to the president. Preventing future abuses also means establishing a credible deterrent through examples, that is, prosecuting the most egregious human rights crimes, the murder of people on the high seas, intentionally subjecting detained migrants and children to inhumane and torturous conditions, deliberate violations of court orders by ICE and other administration agencies, and the blatant and unimaginable levels of corruption that have enriched the president and his allies. So, to recap, I argue that if human rights are to remain meaningful and impactful in the 21st century, we have to work to strengthen rights on three fronts: through reinforcing the moral power of human rights, through reframing human rights to apply to our most pressing needs today, and through seeking justice for the wrongs that have been done. So to wrap up here, I will end where I began. As I said, human rights as we know them today weren't really meant to be when they were codified in the UN Charter over 80 years ago. Nonetheless, their subsequent trajectory and impact shows that it's not up to those in power whether ideas about human rights are meaningful. Human rights became meaningful because people made them meaningful. It's up to us, not them. People made human rights meaningful by acting on these ideas, by refusing to ignore violations of them, and by insisting on holding perpetrators accountable for violations. Today, just as the world was 80 years ago, we're at a crossroads. And the future of human rights will once again depend not on what powerful people want, but what ordinary people demand. That's all I got for today, folks. Thank you so much for being here to listen to what I have to say. I look forward very much to your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks.
Okay, if you have...
I can speak loud.
All right, let me try.
Hello.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, if you have a question, please let me get to you with our microphone so everybody can hear your question.
I'm trying to see if I can remember how to frame this. Does global population put any strain on human rights? Just the abundance of people on this planet versus everything else you were talking about tonight.
Yeah, so this is something that folks bring up sometimes, this idea that like, okay, population growth, like do we have the ability, the resources to kind of continue to provide standard of living, to increase standard of living, given growth of the world's population and kind of the finite size of the world. So I'm not a demographer, and I'm not an economist, but my understanding of this question, if you look back hundreds of years, you can see over and over again there regularly have been kind of these panics about population growth. There's regularly a kind of fear that we're going to run out of resources. We're going to run out of space. We're going to run out of water. We're going to run out of oil or whatever it is. And those fears, time and time again, have been shown to not come to fruition. Have not played out that way. So the way I understand this is that there is actually way more resources available in the world today than we actually need. Like there's plenty of resources in the world. It's less of an issue of an amount and more of an issue of distribution. So it's more of a political problem of the political will being willing to share that wealth and share those resources than it is about a kind of running out of finite resources. That's the way, at least based on what I've read and studied, that's kind of the way I understand this. That it's less about kind of us running out of space and running out of resources than it is about the distribution of the current resources that we have.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, why is the United States the only country in the world that's not signed off on the women's and the children's rights?
Yeah.
And then we'll start with that.
Sure, yeah, so in general, the United States, like I had mentioned previously, doesn't ratify a lot of human rights treaties, although it certainly has ratified some important ones over the years. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on Torture, there's some others. In kind of before getting into like the specifics of those specific treaties, in general, there's a kind of skepticism in U.S. political culture and among the U.S. political leaders towards kind of human rights treaties, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of the reasons that usually get mentioned are that the United States has this kind of political culture of exceptionalism, where it kind of sees itself as kind of apart from and kind of better than other countries around the world. And there's this kind of sentiment, this kind of long-running sentiment that like, okay, human rights are good for you, the rest of the world, but like, we're good here. We don't need those kind of, that international scrutiny, that international oversight of human rights. Like we have this strong tradition of civil rights, and so we we're fine without that system. The United States also typically is very protective of its sovereignty in general, and when you ratify a human rights treaty, in essence, you are, curtailing a little bit of your sovereignty by legally subjecting yourself to a system that is allowed to scrutinize your behavior. It's a weak system, nonetheless, like I mentioned, but it's a system that, that has the right to kind of scrutinize and criticize your behavior. And there's also kind of Cold War, reasons that kind of go back to the Cold War, where some of these treaties were seen as like a kind of back door to letting communism into the United States, because they like require the United States to do things that are traditionally associated with like more socialist regimes, like provide kind of robust safety nets and things like that. So there are kind of political, ideological oppositions to them. When you get into the specifics of these treaties, again, there's like some more specific reasons, like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I think you can apply a lot of those reasons I already mentioned, but there over the years been some like specific kind of concerns, whether those are like good faith concerns or like whether they're like not actually borne out by what's in the treaty or not. There are concerns about whether the treaty is going to kind of override U.S. regulations on abortion, for example, which the treaty doesn't say anything about that, but there's kind of, that's been a perspective that's been articulated over the years that like, oh, this treaty is going to open us up to having to, legalize abortion or things like that. With the rights of the child, again, there's kind of similar fears that the treaty is going to do things that it doesn't actually say, like going to limit the ability of parents to homeschool their children, for example, even though the treaty doesn't say anything about that. So again, there's coming back to this general idea that there's, in American kind of political culture, and particularly among political leaders, there's generally been this skepticism about kind of what international human rights treaties are going to put us on the hook for, and how that could come back to bite us in ways that political leaders don't want to have to be accountable for. So that's kind of a quick and kind of overview of the variety of different rationales why over the years the United States hasn't joined a lot of these treaties.
And then potentially related to that is, has the United States been trending away to be less free, or is that more of a recent phenomenon?
Yeah, so if I recall off the top of my head, looking, so there's a lot of different organizations that do something like what Freedom House does, where it kind of gives countries scores and kind of tracks them over time. So most of those show some kind of decrease over recent years. If I recall off the top of my head, thinking about the Freedom House data, that the decline begins about, about 20 years ago in the United States. It's kind of declined steadily, even through kind of the Democratic administrations has declined, but has kind of the rate of that decline has accelerated with the first and then second Trump administration. But I encourage you to kind of look into that data yourself and kind of understand kind of what kind of goes into that and how they calculate those scores. There's not like one single correct way to do this, and different organizations measure things in different ways, but they all generally kind of point to some kind of decline in the United States over recent years.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering about, you've mentioned several times about the attacks on ships in the ocean, killing people for allegedly carrying drugs to the country. Killed lots of people too.
Sure.
When did the president first get the right to order executions of people without any justice at all? I know it went back at least through the Obama administration. I'm guessing it went back through through the Clinton too, and maybe how far before?
Well, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Well, I got two questions.
Yeah,
That was the first one. When did that start?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, so that depends on what you think is the authorization for that, or if you think there is an authorization for that.
Well, there definitely is. The president can sign off on having a person in another country or in open waters executed.
Well, that's certainly the illegal opinion of the current administration, but what they base that on is up for debate. So if you go back to kind of the previous administrations, like the Obama administration, that the legal authority they usually claimed for those kinds of targeted assassinations of, like, say, Al-Qaeda leaders or other people alleged to be members or leaders of terrorist groups, that was, from a domestic law perspective, that was grounded in the authorization of the use of military force that was initially passed after 9/11. So several US presidential administrations have been relying on that. Many legal scholars point out that that's a very kind of weak foundation to rely on, especially for when you're targeting groups who are unconnected to those original military force aims. Nonetheless, that's been the argument. What sets these new killings apart is that there's really no authorization from Congress for these kinds of killings. The authorization for the use of military force from Congress following 9/11, authorized the president to take action against Al-Qaeda and other kinds of alleged terrorist groups. But no one believed, at least no legal scholars really believe that these drug smugglers are the same thing as terrorists. They are criminals from the perspective of the law. They're not going out and engaging in kind of political violence. They are criminals just like ordinary, the same way that drug dealers on the corner are criminals. And so from that perspective, this is kind of something new and something that Congress has never really authorized explicitly. Certainly the administration claims it has the authority to do this. And then you get to then that's the authority under domestic law. When you get to international law, which is a separate set of regulations, so if you're talking about the legality of the use of force, you have to talk about domestic law and international law. So that, those targeted assassinations by the Obama administration, those also are very questionable under international law, but you could at least make an argument, a tenuous argument, but you can make an argument that they somehow represented a threat to the United States because they were planning attacks against the United States. Because under international law, the only time you're allowed to use military force is in response to an armed attack against you. And so the argument under the Obama administration, well, okay, these people are about to attack us, so we can kind of preemptively attack them. And again, that's a kind of tenuous and a lot of international lawyers would say that's not a valid justification. But when it comes to these drug boat killings, it's not even a close call. There is no indication whatsoever that the people on these boats were going to be waging an armed attack against the United States. So it's just it's not even like within the it's not even in a gray area from the perspective of international law. You can only use force in response to an armed attack. There is no armed attack, and so it's kind of a clear-cut example of a violation of the law of use of force.
I might disagree with you on that because these people are bringing in boats full of drugs that are killing thousands of Americans. But that, that's just the way I see it, the way you see it.
Yeah, and that's the way the administration makes the argument as well. Yeah.
The other question though I have is, you had a graph about economic growth, and it had lines, and it was going across, starting in the expansion of the top 1% was like 300%, and the rest, everybody was kind of bunched together.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I got the numbers half right. But that looks to me like, the top, when you say it's the top 1%, when I read the graph, that's only I shouldn't say only, but it's 1 million people in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is 299 million people. So if you did it as to the number of people, as opposed to the percent, the top percent, how the graph would look totally different. It's presented the way I look at it. I think that's pretty good, because it's showing me that almost everybody in this country has been growing, has an economic growth, which probably means they've had a better life. And some people, yeah, the top 1% have a fantastic growth and do anything they want. But everybody else is still eating real well and enjoying whatever they enjoy. And that's the way I read the graph, because there's so few people in that top line. The next ones are running 20% on the first one, 20% on the bottom one, and 40% in the middle.
Sure.
They're all, if it was lined up to show income gains by the number of people, not by the top percent of earners, but by the number of people, it would look a heck of a lot different, and you might get a totally different picture on it.
Sure, yeah, and I think your point, there's a lot of different ways you can kind of analyze income growth and by different kind of segments of society. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of present this data. I think the point is that even though the pie is growing for everybody, a greater proportion of the economic growth is going to a very small sliver of the population. So it's about kind of how is that growing pie being distributed. More and more of the growing pie is being distributed to a small slice of the population. That's kind of the point that I'm trying to get across with this. So it's kind of, as opposed to being shared equally amongst, the population.
But that would still be, when you look at it the other way and say the economy, the entire economy is the pie, and the size of the slice that's going in the top 1% is very small, because it's only
sure, in absolute terms, yeah.
Absolutely.
In absolute terms, you're right. Yeah,
so
yeah.
It just depends which way you define the graph.
Right, but I guess, so yeah, sure, in absolute terms, you're right, but the point I'm trying to get across is about kind of who is benefiting from, the most relatively, who is where is the growth going, and the way that growth is being distributed is changing over time to be more directed to a small portion of the population.
Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes for questions here. And then if you have some more questions after that, you can still talk to Dr. Berlin up front there. But you had a question there?
Not sure how to phrase this, but going back to the beginning of your presentation,
Sure.
where you were talking about the map of following World War II and the 4 or 5 countries that started the whole UN following FDR.
Sure. Yeah.
So now here we are, however many years later. Those are lofty goals and ideals, but what good are they if a current president, regardless of who it is, can just come in, defund everything, which has resulted in 600,000 deaths in Africa, and just turn it off and say, that's it, we're done. If it's going to be flipping back and forth every 4 years or however long these administrations run, I guess where's the teeth in these policies?
When you say these policies, you're talking about kind of the kind of international
rights.
architecture, or
right? Yeah.
Well, where's the teeth? I mean, I guess that depends on kind of like what I was saying on kind of how people respond. If they respond by trying to reinforce these ideas and these institutions, then that shows that there's something sticky about them, that there's something that they endure in a certain kind of way, beyond just the whims of a particular presidential administration. So I think, I could get into kind of the detail, like nitty gritty of like, okay, well, I can point to this and show you that these institutions still have consequences or impacts, but I think what you're getting at is kind of, in the big picture, like, how do we know they're going to continue to matter, or how do we know they do matter, in general? How do we know that they continue to kind of impact politics and motivate people and kind of restrain repressive leaders? And again, like what I'm saying is, we'll know by the response, and so Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, was obviously like a brazen act of aggression in clear violation of international law on the use of force. So you could say that, okay, that law doesn't matter. They just bulldozed right over it, right? But the way you can see that it still matters, and I'm not saying that it's perfect or it doesn't work the way we would want it to work, in kind of like a reliable way like that. But the way you can see that it still matters is the response to that invasion. How so many countries around the world imposed sanctions on Russia for that. How Russia was kicked out of various organizations, suspended from other institutions. How Russia has become a pariah more than it was already because of that invasion. And the war's still going on. It hasn't caused Russia to end the war, certainly. We would hope that would happen, but it hasn't happened. So I don't want to make a kind of overly optimistic case, but part of what I'm trying to get to do, and this is often what I try to get to do with my students, try to help my students see, is that it's not all good or all bad. Like if you are very optimistic about international law, then I try to get my students to see that, to be a little bit more realistic about it. But if they are very pessimistic about it, then I try to get them to see that it actually can be more effective than they realize. So kind of come back to the example of Russia. We can see that the world cares about the fact that this law was violated, and they have acted. I mean, Europe is costing itself a lot just to reinforce this idea. It has put sanctions on Russian natural gas, and that is increasing natural gas prices in Europe. And so it is sacrificing itself for this idea. And I think that shows you that these ideas do matter, at least for now. I can't really predict the future. I don't know how things are going to go, but I think we can see evidence that these ideas aren't meaningless right now.
Okay, let's do one more quick one if someone has a question here.
I just wanted to say my response would that be, for example, like the No Kings March that's coming up this weekend, where people are responding by, huge numbers of people across the country responding to all of the things that are going on right now.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a very important part of reinforcing human rights ideas, is taking political action, going to protests, demonstrations, and sending a message, sending a signal that these ideas matter and that violating them comes with some kind of cost, that it's not cost-free to just bulldoze over rights.
Okay, I think we'll end right there. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Dr. Berlin.